It began with silence, the kind that follows a layoff notice. A cold gray dawn settled over Ingersoll, Ontario. What had once been hailed as a billion-dollar breakthrough now stood in uncertainty. "We're opening the first full-scale commercial electric vehicle plant in Canada," they declared with pride. That was less than 3 years ago, when Justin Trudeau and Doug Ford stood together and promised a new electric future for Canada. But today, the gates of the Kami assembly plant hang half open. A dim LED sign flickers at the entrance. BrightDrop paused. Across the border, U.S. headlines exploded in red. GM shut down, over 1,000 jobs affected. To many in America, it looked like just another casualty of globalization, another factory lost to the pressures of a changing world. But what came next shocked markets on both sides of the border. Because this time, Canada didn't collapse. Canada adapted. 3 years earlier, General Motors had called the BrightDrop facility its billion-dollar bet on electric vans, a symbol of U.S.-Canada industrial partnership and a promise of cleaner, faster transportation. But then came the tariff wars, 25% duties on steel, aluminum, and EV components. Production costs surged. By September 2025, GM was forced to hit pause. The damage seemed unavoidable, 350 new layoffs and 700 to 800 jobs already lost in the months before. Analysts predicted disaster. Markets braced for a collapse similar to what had happened in U.S. auto towns many times before, but that collapse never came. Instead of panic, Ottawa and Queen's Park quietly launched a coordinated response. Emergency worker retraining programs, supplier credit protections to keep factories alive, local procurement laws to redirect production inside Canada, power incentives that rerouted industrial electricity to keep small EV startups running. It was an invisible economic shield. While factories in Michigan and Ohio struggled with layoffs that never made national news, Ontario survived the impact. The difference was clear. Canada played the long game. By Q3 of 2025, while U.S. EV exports to Europe fell by 12%, Canadian EV exports rose by 18%. Stock analysts called it the BrightDrop paradox, a shutdown that didn't break the system, but revealed how policy discipline can outperform political noise. Tonight, boardrooms across North America are asking the same question. How did a country hit by the same tariffs and the same global slowdown come out stronger, while others stumbled? Because sometimes the real shock isn't when production stops. It's what happens after the lights go out. The parking lot outside the Kami plant was half empty, but not abandoned. A few dozen workers stood quietly under a gray October sky. No shouting. No protest. Just a hard silence, the kind that holds more truth than words ever could. For weeks, headlines called it another failure of the EV transition. But behind the plant gates, something unexpected was happening. When GM halted BrightDrop production in late September 2025, everyone expected the usual chain reaction: layoffs, panic, collapse. But this time, the dominoes stopped falling. Within hours, Unifor, the auto union, triggered a clause buried deep in its contract, a replacement vehicle provision. GM was now forced to either compensate workers or assign a new model to the plant. Ottawa's Ministry of Industry deployed a rapid response team to the site. Ontario froze industrial electricity rate hikes, preventing a wave of small supplier shutdowns. On paper, over $60 million USD in wages were at risk. In reality, not a single local supplier went bankrupt. Why? Because Canada didn't react emotionally. It responded strategically. Retraining centers opened immediately. Within 5 days, more than 400 workers had been reassigned to battery logistics and diagnostics. Tier 1 suppliers that once relied solely on BrightDrop were redirected to government fleet contracts to keep production lines moving. Logistics were rerouted. Canadian warehouses took inventory back from Detroit to keep the domestic supply chain alive. Economists now call it the shock absorber model, a circular response system. OEM, supplier, union, government, back to OEM this. Loop didn't prevent crisis, but it contained it. Across the border, similar GM plants in Indiana and Michigan didn't have that protection. Production cuts spread like wildfire, taking down subcontractors and local economies. But in Ontario, the chain stayed intact. The system held. It is a paradox few expected. A shutdown that tested Canada's manufacturing resilience and revealed an economy that has quietly learned not to fear volatility, but to manage it. Because true strength isn't about avoiding the storm. It's about knowing where to place the brake before the next domino falls. It didn't begin with panic, it began with pressure. A single number became a weapon, 25%. One policy line from Washington sent a shockwave through the North American auto industry, rewriting costs, contracts, and futures in a matter of days. When the new tariffs hit in mid-2025, every vehicle assembled in Canada suddenly cost more to build. Every bolt, every battery pack, every imported chip became a financial burden. At General Motors' BrightDrop division, the impact was instant. Prices on imported components surged. Aluminum frames, semiconductors, even simple wiring harnesses, everything went up overnight. Internal documents later leaked revealed the real damage, over $1.1 billion new tax exposure in just one quarter. And if the tariffs stayed active for a year, that number would soar to $4.5 billion USD from GM alone. This wasn't trade strategy anymore. This was financial warfare, a cost war fought with invoices instead of missiles. But the shock didn't end in Canada. On the American side of the border, GM's U.S. operations should have benefited. Instead, they were hit even harder. $4.5 billion in tariffs and another $4 billion in restructuring losses from redrawing supply lines and renegotiating domestic content rules. Steel and energy prices spiked. Factories paused. Suppliers bled. Across the ocean, Europe watched quietly. The EU was tightening carbon tariffs and origin rules, forcing automakers to justify every gram of emissions. In Asia, South Korea and ASEAN partners moved fast, building regional supply chains that dodged U.S. tariffs entirely. And then there was Canada. Where others reacted with chaos, Canada chose controlled stability. Policies didn't swing with headlines. Energy prices stayed stable. Logistics flowed. Provincial tax credits softened price shocks. Yes, production costs still rose, but in Canada the rise was 8%, compared to 17% in U.S. plants. Behind these numbers was a quiet truth. When an economic storm hits, the side with colder nerves and steadier hands wins. Even analysts at J.P. Morgan and RBC admitted the irony. Tariffs that were supposed to bring manufacturing back to America actually pushed investors north of the border. This wasn't theory. It was survival. For workers, it meant food on the table. For automakers, it was the difference between layoffs and lifelines. Because when a 25% wall rises overnight, it doesn't just block trade, it exposes who is built on reaction. And who is built on resilience. And that resilience didn't happen by accident. It was engineered. When GM froze BrightDrop production, most expected another manufacturing tragedy. Shutdown, layoffs, collapse. But Ottawa pulled a lever that almost nobody outside policy circles even knew existed, the Strategic Industry Response Fund. A $5 billion emergency shield, buried deep in federal budgets, built exactly for this moment. Within 72 hours of GM's shutdown, money began moving, quietly, precisely. Small part suppliers in Windsor got stabilization grants. Logistics firms near Guelph received bridge financing to protect payroll. Battery startups in Hamilton got emergency guarantees to keep production alive. No press conferences. No bureaucracy. Just action. And there was more. The Regional Adjustment Fund, originally capped at $450 million, was quietly doubled to $1 billion, giving provincial governments immediate fuel to keep at-risk towns afloat. The logic was brutal but simple. Stop layoffs before they begin. Then came the people strategy. Over $450 million was unlocked to retrain nearly 50,000 displaced workers, not in months but within weeks. Training pipelines redirected thousands into battery assembly, diagnostics, and EV logistics from London to Sudbury. This was not charity. This was industrial defense. From 2020 to 2024, Canada had already secured over $46 billion USD in EV investments from giants like Volkswagen, Honda, and Stellantis. Then it stacked another $52.5 billion USD in incentives, the largest industrial package per GDP in the entire G7. Call it what you want. Subsidy economics, strategic capitalism, survival engineering. But one thing became clear. Canada didn't wait for global stability. It built its own. Those billions weren't sitting in spreadsheets, they were already in motion. They were wiring together supply chains, securing critical mineral deals, signing long-term energy contracts, and stabilizing factories that should have gone dark. Every subsidy, every clause, every emergency check moved with purpose, driving toward one word: stability. While the United States leaned on shock politics, pumping tariffs and igniting corporate panic, and the European Union drowned itself in environmental paperwork and bureaucratic compliance, Canada made a different choice: practical strategy over noise. Fast cash where it mattered. Real guarantees, not speeches. Results, not headlines. Economists started calling it the Ottawa model, a hybrid of financial discipline and industrial muscle. And you could see it not just on policy charts, but on the ground. At the Port of Windsor, ships never stopped moving. At the Cami plant, maintenance crews stayed on site, machines stayed warm. In community colleges from Hamilton to London, enrollment in EV battery diagnostics tripled in a month. Output dipped, but confidence didn't. And in economics, confidence is the oxygen that keeps industries breathing during a storm. Prime Minister Mark Carney, former Bank of England chief and architect of Canada's economic strategy, summed it up in one line that was quoted around the world: "Stability isn't fortune, it's architecture." And Canada's architecture held. Inflation stayed controlled under 3.1%. The Canadian dollar held its range. Consumer confidence, shaken but standing, remained higher than the G7 average. Canada had built something rare in a turbulent global economy: a fiscal shock absorber. A web of policies designed not to prevent crisis, but to catch it before impact. But resilience always comes with a price. Public debt climbed. The national debt ratio pushed toward 43%. Interest payments began testing the limits of fiscal comfort. Even allies in Europe and Asia began asking the same question in quiet diplomatic rooms: how long can Ottawa keep protecting its economy while the world keeps throwing punches? Because in an age of permanent instability, stability may be the most expensive product of all. And as the next American tariff wave loomed over North American industry, another question followed. Can a country built on balance survive a world built on chaos? But it wasn't tariffs or trade that delivered Canada's toughest test. It was the cold. January 2025. Southern Ontario froze. Temperatures plunged to -15. Delivery trucks that once glided across city streets began to crawl. Batteries sagged. Performance dropped. Across the country, EV range losses hit brutal levels, between 14% and 39%, even in mild sub-zero conditions. By mid-February, nearly 65% of electric vehicle owners in Canada reported winter performance failures. Nature had issued a reality check. Physics doesn't care about policy. But instead of pulling back, Canada treated the cold not as a crisis, but as a classroom. In a steel warehouse in Waterloo, a startup named Polaran Energy began testing cold adaptive electrolytes, battery chemistry designed to hold charge even below freezing. In Toronto, Purolator and Canada Post quietly shifted fleets into hybrid hydrogen systems to avoid winter delivery failures. In Quebec, engineers at Hydro-Quebec Research started experimenting with thermal recycling, capturing motor heat and feeding it back into frozen batteries. Self-heating energy loops born from necessity, every problem was turned into an experiment. Every adaptation bought time. Every hour of delivery saved meant contracts survived. Margins held. Jobs stayed. For a logistics economy worth over $95 billion USD, small engineering fixes became national protection. As one analyst in Ottawa said, stability isn't abstract. It's delivering a package when it's 20 below zero. Around the world, the race to master cold climate EVs began. Nordic countries leaned on heated battery grids. Japan fine-tuned energy-saving power management. But Canada chose chemistry over complexity and built what experts now call the Northern Operating Model, because the cold didn't break Canada's EV transition. It forced it to evolve. Every frozen morning became a stress test. Every delivery route became a case study in endurance. And in the end, one reality stood clear. The future of clean transport won't be decided in boardrooms or trade deals. It will be decided on frozen roads where batteries either fail or fight back. So now the world is asking, in a race toward electrification, Who truly knows how to keep the power on when the planet freezes? It wasn't rescued from collapse. This system simply learned to breathe on its own. Because here, a supply chain isn't a fragile line. It's a living ecosystem. From St. Thomas, where Volkswagen is pouring $7 billion into a battery facility, to Windsor, where the Stellantis LG Energy mega plant climbs toward the skyline, to Ingersoll, home of BrightDrop, Ontario's industrial heartbeat moves in unison. 3 hubs, 1 coordinated rhythm, and connecting them are thousands of suppliers, engineers, machinists, welders, not chasing headlines but building momentum. When tariffs shook markets and winter storms threatened production, this network didn't break, it flexed. Suppliers switched contracts without chaos. Engineers who once built fuel engines now assemble EV power modules. Thanks to tight logistics between provinces, a part stamped in Guelph on Monday can be wired into an EV in Windsor by midweek, without ever facing a border checkpoint. This isn't luck, it's structure. Powered by a grid that is 90% carbon-free and incredibly stable, Ontario offers predictable industrial energy at 25-35% lower cost than many U.S. Midwestern states. While American states swing between political cycles and deregulated power markets, Ontario and Quebec deliver the one thing global investors value above everything else: policy stability. Predictability has become currency. In a world where ESG is not a buzzword but a balance sheet requirement, Canada's clean energy grid lowers financing costs for factories and fleets alike. Every ton of carbon saved, every megawatt hour of clean power translates into cheaper capital. That's not a marketing slogan. That's design. Some call it the EV supercluster. Locals have a better name, the Trust Network. Because power here doesn't just come from lithium or electrons, it comes from reliability. When the global supply chain strains, Ontario becomes the steady pulse that keeps North American production alive. As one veteran engineer from Windsor said, when supply chains need oxygen, Ontario delivers the pulse. That pulse is growing louder. New feeder plants now line Highway 401. Colleges can't train EV technicians fast enough. The province, once afraid of losing jobs to the U.S., is now exporting talent west and north. The question has changed. It's no longer, can Ontario survive without GM? It's now, can GM survive without Ontario's rhythm? This story doesn't begin on a factory floor. It begins deep beneath Canada's northern rock, in Sudbury's nickel mines, in Quebec's lithium fields. What once shipped raw to foreign refineries now fuels a national supply chain strategy. Made in Canada is no longer a label, it's a system. From mine to module, chemistry to manufacturing line, rail to port, Canada has built a sovereign supply chain. After GM pressed pause, Ottawa chose not to retreat. It advanced toward independence. By 2025, Canada flipped its industrial model, from exporting raw minerals to refining and processing them at home for the first time in decades. Nickel, cobalt, lithium, the elemental pillars of electric transport, are now processed inside Canadian borders. That isn't nostalgia, it's power. The strategy is precise. Refine in the north, assemble in the south. Battery chemistry labs in Montreal deliver innovation to cell factories in St. Thomas and Windsor. Those packs enter the EV corridor, rolling out vehicles that already meet strict European carbon standards. By 2026, Canada will export its first fully carbon-certified EVs to Europe, one of the toughest regulatory markets in the world. Follow the money. Public investment now leads private capital by 14%. Not to control business, but to control destiny. By owning upstream mineral refining, Canada captures pricing, patents, and long-term leverage, value that once leaked overseas. In a world where minerals are the new oil, this isn't protectionism, it's insurance. Meanwhile, the world races. The U.S. tries to build domestic demand with the Inflation Reduction Act. Europe locks in green supply chains. And sitting between them, Canada quietly becomes the bridge delivering stability across the Atlantic, not the cheapest producer. Not the loudest storyteller, but the one that delivers. EV exports will hit $12.8 billion USD by 2026, doubling Canada's pre-pandemic auto trade with Europe. Ports in Halifax and Montreal now prepare lithium shipping lanes, new arteries connecting Arctic rock to European roads. Economists call this the redrawing of North America's industrial map. Because this isn't about saving an auto plant. It's about rewriting how a nation defines value. Maybe the real story isn't GM's shutdown. Maybe the real story is what survived after it. What began as a shutdown became a stress test. When GM paused BrightDrop in Ontario, experts predicted layoffs, supply panic, economic shock. None of that happened. Wages held, jobs shifted. Retraining rolled out within days. Delivery networks never missed a beat. Families kept their income. Prices stayed stable. Crisis didn't cause chaos. It proved resilience. In a year of tariffs, inflation, and geopolitical shockwaves, Canada didn't panic. It executed, with fiscal cushioning, stable energy, long horizon policy, structure over slogan. Where others built walls, Canada built adaptation. The shutdown was a test. The test became a model, because in a world obsessed with reaction, Canada proved that calm is power. And now, a question echoes across North America. Can the supply chain really function without Canada at its center?